Funding for this program is provided by the National Institute of Justice.
Residential punishment, 19 years in Texas Department of Corrections.
Hello, I'm James Wilson. Perhaps 500,000 Americans are addicted to heroin. A disproportionate number of them are criminals. Although many turn to crime before they turn to heroin, the combination is devastating. Addicted criminals commit 5 or 6 times as many crimes when they are regularly using heroin than when they are not. Many regular users admit committing 300 or more crimes a year. What can society do about it? Some people think we should make heroin legal, ending the motive for criminal behavior. Others say that heroin is too destructive to legalize under any circumstances. There is also an argument about how to enforce existing laws. Should police activity be directed at the big dealers who import the drug or the street-level pushers who sell it to the addicts? And apart from crime, there is the question of whether heroin should be made available to ease the pain of terminally ill patients. Here to discuss these issues are Professor John Kaplan of the Stanford Law School, Professor Arnold Trebach of American University, and Ed Dennis, United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. John Kaplan, why does our society make heroin illegal?
Well, I think with respect to a large number of drugs, called drugs of abuse, there is a feeling that the damage these drugs do to the user and to society is so great that we should be willing to endure the cost of making the drug criminal in order to lower the use.
What is the damage it does to the individual?
Well, heroin is an addicting drug, and it is a drug that alters consciousness. And basically, the idea of a short-acting opiate, which requires a dose every 4 to 6 hours and makes one high at the beginning of the dose and sort of deprived and depressed toward the end, is really incompatible with social functioning in our society, at least with a very high percentage of users. And as a result, we think that as bad as the costs of criminalization are, the public health costs are greater.
You don't dispute the fact that heroin addicts, while using heroin, are much more likely to commit certain forms of predatory street crimes than persons who are not using heroin.
No. That's one of the costs. Indeed, that's probably the major cost of keeping heroin illegal, that we cut down on the number of people who use it by a very substantial amount, I believe, but we make life much more difficult and expensive for the people who will continue to use it, and a very high percentage of them have to raise the money for their heroin habits through crime.
Is there a third way? Could we keep heroin illegal but allow doctors to prescribe it for persons who are already addicts, so presumably they wouldn't have to steal, while still restricting its distribution to persons who are not already addicts? Is that possible?
I don't think so in our kind of society. Our medical profession simply isn't disciplined enough, and our heroin addicts are simply too clever in dealing with a very valuable commodity to restrict them to just simply the amount they will use. They will simply turn around and sell it. They will bribe doctors to prescribe massive amounts. And the amount of heroin a person, an addict, uses varies so enormously that there's virtually no way of checking it. And as a result, we would release a flood of heroin onto the streets. If it were only restricted to addicts, it wouldn't be a very serious problem. But my guess is that the great part of the heroin would go to non-addicts and make a new and greatly increasing supply of addicts with all of the concomitant public health problems.
Is there any possibility of curing a known addict?
Well, known addicts often get cured, but we aren't very good at making them cured. And it's very much like cigarette smoking. Many people give up smoking cigarettes, but our efforts to cure them of smoking cigarettes are very, very inadequate. We aren't very good at it.
Do you think it's being illegal facilitates or impedes the process of self-directed cures?
Oh, I think it facilitates the method of cure simply because the more illegal it is, the harder it is to get. And though, of course, heroin is not as hard as we'd like it in many areas, at least it isn't like you just pass a drugstore and see cigarettes on sale and yield to the impulse of the moment. No, I think making heroin illegal facilitates the process of cure, of giving up the drug, but of course it makes the life of the addict a great deal worse, and it may reduce him to such terrible straits that the fact is he has no real prospects of making a living once he is cured.
Let me turn to Ed Dennis for a moment. John Kaplan has said in effect that we keep heroin illegal in order to reduce the number of total addicts at the price of encouraging those addicts that exist to steal. From your perspective as a law enforcement officer, is that price too high? Are we encouraging too many crimes by having heroin a totally illegal substance?
No, I don't believe that we are. First of all, I'm not sure that it's the case that those that are heroin addicts and are committing crimes would not be committing crimes in any case. I'm sure there are a percentage of those individuals that use heroin that, whether they were using it or not, would be committing crimes. The other aspect is that individuals, for whatever reason, I believe will commit crimes to support themselves and other habits as well. And whether or not that's as a direct result of having a heroin habit or being addicted to luxury automobiles or addicted to money is difficult to say. I don't believe that that relationship is necessarily so strong that we can attribute all crimes committed by a heroin addict to their love of heroin.
Let me ask you this. Many people would agree with what you and John Kaplan have said, but then look around and say, nevertheless, we're losing the war. More and more heroin comes in, more and more addicts on the street. In your judgment, can we win, or alternatively, have we made progress?
Yes, we can win, and I believe that we will win. I've devoted myself professionally a substantial period of my career to drug law enforcement, but I do not believe that we will win really in the roundhouses and in the offshore tracking of international shipments of illicit drugs. I think we will win in the homes and the churches and the communities of this country. I think that's where the battle against drug abuse has to be fought.
Well, let me look at the law enforcement component of that battle for a moment. Some people say that the best use of our resources is to go after Mr. Big, the top distributor. And other people say, the key element of the system is the street-level pusher who hangs around in front of schools and churches and sells. Where do you think our effort should be focused?
I think it depends upon the jurisdiction. In the federal jurisdiction, we are best able to deal with illicit drug trafficking on the regional level, on the international level, dealing with the high-level drug traffickers, with the financial networks that are supplying the logistic support for drug trafficking. Those are well beyond the means of local law enforcement. I believe that working with local law enforcement, we can deal with the mid-level drug traffickers. There are drug trafficking task forces composed of local police officers but using federal money to deal with the mid-level drug traffickers. The low-level, street-level drug traffickers, I think, are going to have to be primarily the responsibility of local law enforcement with some federal support.
Let me ask you this. Many people feel that we've made no progress. The situation gets worse and worse. My understanding of the national data are that over the last few years, the quality of drugs available, the price of drugs available on the street, the number of heroin-related deaths in the cities has been more or less flat. It hasn't gone up, it hasn't gone down. Does that conform with your experience in Philadelphia?
Yes, I believe that our heroin situation, although it is not good, it has not worsened over the years. And I've been involved with drug law enforcement in the Philadelphia area for the last 10 years. We've seen increases in the use and abuse of other drugs, but heroin, I think, has remained relatively stable.
Do the people who leave heroin for any reason simply go on to other equally dangerous drugs, PCP, cocaine, barbiturates?
It has been my experience that when a heroin addict finds that heroin is difficult to find will move to other drugs. Now, this is, of course, just an empirical observation from dealing with some heroin addicts as witnesses in cases that I've had, but I think that probably research would bear out the fact that heroin addicts will use other drugs as a substitute.
Arnold Treback, many people, when they hear the subject of heroin discussed, refer immediately to something called the British system. Now, they probably don't do this with a lot of information, so could you tell me what was the British system, what is the British system today, how has it changed?
Until 1968, about March of 1968, if you or I were addicted, and these gentlemen were doctors, we could go to them and say, we're addicted. Well, what's an addict? An addict, in Britain and here, is a sick person, a person who has a disease. We could say, I would like to be treated with heroin. Now, these gentlemen, as British doctors, would have the right to say, no thanks, I don't do that. I don't give out heroin, I don't give out Valium. I believe you should deal with your own inadequacies and stop that foolishness. On the other hand, legally, they had the right to say, all right, let's talk about it. I want to test you to see if you're really addicted, and if I decide you are, I may well put you on maintenance doses of heroin.
Now, what happened to change that in 1968?
What happened was, for reasons no one can understand, the situation went out of control, and instead of having, mums in the Midlands who are, on drugs and weren't even considered an addict by their husband, the husband would say, Matilda, have you taken your medicine? And she would take her heroin. All right? We had a lot of deviant young addicts in the cities. Some of those drugs came from excess supplies of legal prescriptions. They decided they would have to control it more and set up a system where only specially licensed doctors could provide the drugs. Most of these doctors were, could only handle heroin and cocaine. Most of those doctors were in special clinics. However, right now, any British doctor can provide to any patient any drug, either for maintenance or for maintenance of an addiction or for terminal cancer, except heroin and cocaine. Those specially licensed doctors now provide the drugs to addicts, sometimes providing heroin and cocaine, but those doctors have decided they want to cut down on heroin prescriptions. Cocaine was never much of a drug that reached many addicts through doctors. So heroin was a key one.
Now, why do the doctors, the specially licensed doctors in the clinics, why are they cutting back on the supply of heroin to addicts?
In their view, they felt that they didn't see enough change. They felt that patients kept coming back for their prescriptions and didn't change enough. And as a result, they said, let's try some of these new inventions from overseas, psychotherapy, oral methadone. And as a result, they have cut down on the prescriptions, but the government has not forced them to. This is not a government decision. In fact, the people in the Home Office who I know abhor it. The result has been this, that large numbers of addicts now don't go to the clinics. Large numbers of them are out in the street seeking their drugs, and a large group of private prescribers, or independent prescribers, have arisen who quite legally give out drugs. Not heroin and cocaine, to be sure, but a lot of other drugs to a lot of other addicts. Recently, there has been a counter-movement saying we've got to go back to heroin prescriptions because this refusal on the part of the doctors is kicking up the black market again.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that in this country, given our large pool of addicts, doctors under some regulation should be allowed to prescribe heroin to maintain the habits of addicts?
Absolutely. Positively. Let me back up a bit away from the subject of heroin for just a moment and say this. I'm working on a new book and looking at the whole international scene on drugs, not just heroin, but the whole scene, the trafficking, the violence that's increasing. I'm a very worried man. I see a real war starting to occur with real casualties. Just recently, Colombian traffickers allegedly put out a contract to kidnap the head of our DEA. I fear that the Bill of Rights in various respects will be infringed. And so I think what's got to occur is a peace movement in this field. We're not winning the war. We're doing a horrible job of containing the drugs, and therefore I look for peaceful resolutions. One peaceful approach would be to allow doctors to help some addicts with prescriptions of heroin and other drugs, not just heroin.
Let me turn to John Kaplan and Ed Dennis. John, Arnold would like to allow doctors under some circumstances to prescribe a variety of drugs, including heroin. What's your response?
I would like doctors to do it too, but I'd like the kind of doctors who could do it, and I simply don't have sufficient confidence in human nature. Either the nature of the doctors and the tremendous profit margins involved for those who are willing or will be willing in America to prescribe heroin, and I don't have sufficient confidence in the human nature of addicts whom we would have to trust not to take the prescribed heroin at a very low price and turn around and sell it at a very, very much higher price to non-addicts.
Now, we now let doctors, under certain circumstances in clinics, prescribe oral methadone. What's the difference between prescribing methadone and prescribing heroin?
Two major differences. One is oral methadone is taken by mouth. And it turns out that a drug taken by mouth, the same drug, is far less of a public health problem and far less destructive than a drug taken intravenously through the needle because of the rapid onset of the drug and the rapid diminution of effects. It's sort of like the roller coaster effect when you take a drug intravenously, and it also involves a large number of public health problems. Secondly, methadone happens just to be a much longer acting opiate. And what that means is you, instead of taking a new dose of heroin every 4 to 6 hours, you take a dose of methadone every 24 hours. And the importance of that is that fits on a regular schedule. You take it before you go to sleep.
Ed, what do you think would be the effect of allowing certain doctors, perhaps specially selected doctors in Philadelphia, to prescribe heroin to maintain the habits of the existing addicts?
I'm not sure it would be that beneficial to the overall problem. We do now have controlled substances that can be prescribed. It's a part of the responsibility of the Drug Enforcement Administration to make sure that those prescriptions are given legally, and we have found that there are serious problems with the abuse of prescription drugs, so that if heroin were made a prescription drug to be distributed under limited circumstances, I feel that we would be dealing with the same problem. We've had problems with methadone being sold illegally at black market prices, and I just have no confidence that the medical profession would be able to deal with the problems of distributing.
Arnold, what's your response to
My
this leakage
response
problem?
is that my response is this: absolutely, there'll be leakage. Of course, there'll be leakage. There's leakage now. The big point is this: I think we've got to start looking at addicts for what they really are. I speak to hundreds of them over the years, and there are dozens of them who just come to see me to talk. And they bear as much similarity to one another as any non-addict does. Milton, the Jewish grandfather from Baltimore, says, I said, "Do you hurt yourself when you inject?" He looks at me like I'm a fool. He says, "Why should I hurt myself when I inject? I've been taking heroin for 40 years. And I once hurt myself in New Orleans with a jazz band. But that was the only time. Went to the hospital for a little while. There are other people, and so he wants his heroin and should get it. His doctor wants to give him dilaudid, which is still legal, but the doctor will lose his license. Milton may die on the block in Baltimore seeking heroin because he can't get any legal narcotic. I think of another person, Xavier, not his real name. He came to me in London one day saying he'd relapsed. I took him to a clinic, and he detoxified. The last thing anyone should do is give Xavier heroin. Right now, he's fighting himself off drugs, and I hold his hand. No heroin for him. Another young fella, Ned, who comes to me all the time. He's doing beautifully. He hates methadone. It tried his soul. Heroin, he said, he could have detoxed on much easier. The last thing we want for Ned are any drugs whatsoever because he's doing fine. My point is, addicts are decent human beings for the most part. If we treat them decently, they may treat us decently. But it's not just heroin. It's a wide range of options we must provide for them.
Now, let me ask you this. Suppose it were true, as John Kaplan and Ed Dennis predict, that if we allowed doctors to prescribe heroin, there would be sufficient leakage to expand the pool of the number of people regularly using heroin. Let's suppose that just for the purposes of argument.
That worries me.
Does the government have some responsibility for the moral quality or the character of its citizens? Should it worry about the fact that there are more people using heroin than there had been?
I think it would certainly worry me. It worries me now. Dealing with addicts so often, I'm appalled when I see them in the throes of a heroin addiction. They're miserable, most of them, except those who are settled in their habits. So what I'm saying is, yes, the government should be worried. But we'd be balancing off gains and losses. And, for example, on the doctors, we would trade off the possibility of a larger number of crooked doctors for the imminent probability of a greater number of law-abiding addicts, injecting heroin to be sure, but off the streets and, you know, out of our bedrooms, out of our homes. So those are the balances. You're right, though. Those dangers are there. When I weigh them, I come out differently than my colleagues.
John, how do you weigh this balance? Arnold seems to be willing to run some risk of an increased number of addicts because he thinks the addicts who will be helped are basically decent people. Is that your sense of who addicts are today?
Well, I don't know. I find it very difficult to talk about basically decent people. People who are now heroin addicts have pressures upon them which cause them to do things which are not decent. And it would be wonderful if we could take off this pressure. Personally, if we could avoid the pressure and give addicts the heroin they need at the price of doubling the number of addicts from 500,000 to 1 million, I would be willing to do it and regard it as a close question. But on the other hand, I'm not convinced that we would be merely doubling the number of addicts. We might increase the number of addicts by a factor of 20. And then I worry.
See, I wouldn't know how that would occur, how we would increase it by a factor of 20. I have no notion. Because under the approach I'm saying, it would be the same as giving out methadone or Valium or insulin. It would be under medical control with some leakage. I can't imagine people wanting to try heroin merely because they might go and be able to con a doctor. Right now, you can buy all the heroin you want within 3 miles of here. Just produce the cash, we'll bring you a ton. So I don't think you're going to increase the availability that much.
Well, let's look at the question of Britain, if that provides any analogy. You said earlier that during the older British system, when doctors were regularly prescribing it, there was a substantial increase in the number of addicts. I don't know by how many fold, but let's assume it might have been 4-fold or 5-fold.
It was closer to 15-fold.
15-fold. Is there a reason to believe that...
I don't think it was that much, but go ahead.
That a similar increase, or perhaps a less increase, but a large increase would occur here for the same reasons, that somehow there was diversion or leakage from the system?
I don't think so for this reason. I honestly believe that our law enforcement has been so unable to control this that the availability of heroin now is amazing. I once asked a group of officers about 2 miles from the White House, I was addressing a class of policemen, 3rd Precinct, V Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C., how long would it take a boy of 15 with the cash to buy heroin in this neighborhood if he didn't know it? A stranger. They talked and they came up with half an hour for a connection. Now, that's on V Street Northwest within the shadow of the White House. So my feeling is that, you know, if a kid wants to buy it now, he goes out in the street. Under the system I'm proposing, he has to talk to a doctor. So while there could be some increase, I wouldn't see a great deal of increase.
John, what is the logic by which new persons get inducted into the world of using, at first experimentally, heroin? He said it takes a half hour to find it. Do people who are thinking about using for heroin go and look for it, or do they get recruited in some other way?
By and large, they run into a friend who happens to have it at the time, and the friend offers them some. Or they bug the friend into giving them some. Now, where the friend gets it, he buys it from somebody else or does a service to a dealer. My problem is, it may very well be that some people looking for heroin could find it in half an hour, but a kid from the suburbs where heroin is unavailable would take such terrible risks going into the areas that heroin is available that as a practical matter he won't do it today, and that's why there are only 500,000 addicts. My
addict informants, who I'd love to have you meet, they're brilliant, all right? One is a suburban kid, white kid, who regularly made us, and I have another one who's a government official, white, a blonde-haired lady who buys, both of them buy on the streets of Washington. It's dangerous, let me tell you, but they go because they know what's going on. They know that, Tuesday is jump out day. The police jump out that day and get you, so you watch that day. And they know there are certain streets you don't go on. And they've been arrested and hurt by the police, on the other hand, and robbed. On the other hand, that's where they make their buys.
Yeah. Well,
white suburban kids.
I have a simple view. It's like saying that the race is not always to the swift. It is true, but if you place your bets like that, you will lose your shirt. The fact is, most people who use heroin use it because it was easily available to them, and the massive majority of Americans do not have heroin easily available.
Let me ask Ed Dennis. He has watched, I think, the supply of heroin on the streets of Philadelphia change. Do you think that the ease of access to heroin is a consequence of the degree of law enforcement pressure we're bringing on, or does law enforcement really not make much difference in this person wanting to find heroin for the first time?
Absolutely. Law enforcement is the key factor in keeping the price of heroin as high as it is and making it as difficult to obtain. Well, there may be some question about how difficult it is in certain areas. I've seen the flow of heroin from Mexico decrease substantially. Of course, it increased with regard to supplies coming from the Far East and coming from the East Asian area through Sicily. But there's no question that law enforcement had a very substantial impact on the availability of heroin and the price of heroin in our area.
Let me say this. I'm not denying the role of law enforcement at all, gentlemen, at all. I'm simply saying that because the demand is so strong, that law enforcement has an impact, and it has interrupted the flow. But what I've seen is almost an iron rule of the opium trade in the world. You know, when a supply line gets interrupted, as long as the demand is there, a supply, you know, applies. I will not use his name. I have a friend who defends heroin addicts in the middle of Philadelphia. I'll tell you his name later. And I said, have you ever seen the supply interrupted? He says, yes, for 3 or 4 days, sometimes a week. And my people have to go from the north side to the south side or to the west side. But within a week, normally, they can make a connection.
Well, I agree with you that demand is the key factor here. I mean, it's the demand that is fueling the drug traffic. It is not the supply that's fueling it. And that's the reason I made the statement about whether we would win the war on drug abuse really depends upon the demand side, I believe.
How would you deal with the demand side? You mentioned the schools and the churches, but what concretely does that mean?
Well, I honestly believe that we must remove the romanticism that I think has grown up around drug abuse. I see much too much glamorizing of drug abuse in films and in our media. I see schools in which apparently drug abuse has become much too common. I remember an era growing up myself where drug abuse was so remote that it was something you heard about and you thought it was happening, 1,000 miles away. Today, my wife is in the public educational system. It is just much too common, much too available. And I believe we can turn back that trend.
John, do you see a way of reducing demand?
Well, one thing I do have to say is that an addicting drug is classically a drug for which the supply creates the demand. In other words, this is a very unusual kind of situation we're in. The reason we've have a demand for heroin now is simply because in the past we have had a supply. I personally don't think we're going to win the war against heroin in the foreseeable future. I don't think we're going to lose it. It's going to be a nagging problem like poverty and 100 other ones, and the best we can do is fight it to a draw.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching. For Crime File, I'm James Wilson.
Funding for this program was provided by the National Institute of Justice. This program was produced by the Police Foundation, which is solely responsible for its content.